All right, so today we're gonna get into this Predator 420cc engine, and we're gonna be pulling the governor out and showing you guys how to do that. In the process, we're also gonna kind of disassemble this, because we're gonna be adding a bunch of performance parts to ours, and there's a good chance if you're pulling your governor out, maybe you're doing the same thing, so we might as well go through that. Before we even get started, the governor's kind of like a cruise control. These are generally utility engines used in generators, power washers, things like that, where basically you want to set the engine at peak torque and try and stay there regardless of the load. So what the governor does is it reacts to various differences in the load and tries to maintain whatever RPM you have it set to. Again, that's all well and good if you're trying to maintain 1 RPM at all times, but for us, we don't want it trying to pull our throttle back. So we're gonna go ahead and pull the governor out of this one, and hopefully it should make our throttle a little more linear and less jerky. And now, I apologize, we had this partially disassembled from earlier, so generally there'll be some hoses that come off here, and with the various different configurations, if you get a California emissions standard engine, probably have a smog box that gets mounted down here. All that stuff is for like emissions reasons, for performance. It's all gotta go. The gas tank up top here is held on with, if I remember correctly, some 10mm bolts, and then I think maybe some 13mm nuts. And once you remove those, like we already have, and in my case, lost them because we're not using them, this bad boy will come right off. And you can see here, I've already loosened the hose clamps, but there's a little hose here. This is where your fuel line goes to your carburetor. We can go ahead and just pull that right off, just like that. Now we can see we have a better look at the actual governor arm and the whole assembly itself. You can see here, this is the arm that goes into the engine and connects to the actual governor gear, and that is what's modulating your throttle independent of the actual throttle that you input from your pedal in our case, right? So we're gonna be getting rid of all this and kind of setting it up instead that we can just control it directly with the throttle as you would kind of expect. So our carburetor is actually underneath this whole plastic shrouding and box. And in the case of the particular Predator that we have, the box just kind of clips off from the side here, rotates out, and we've got this air filter sitting right on top. This engine is a Hemi, so it's got a hemispherical head. You can tell that by right over here, actually. The Hemis have this sort of bow tie shaped valve cover, and the standard engine, which we have on this cart here, has this more stop sign shaped valve cover. So you can see a difference there. Another way to know if you have a Hemi or not, they don't actually advertise the difference between the Hemis and non-Hemis. Engines that end in 4.9 are your Hemis. You'll see that right on the box. So in our Hemi version, we've got the air filter up on top like this. There's a little wing nut. You can spin this right off here. And the air filter will pop right off. We got a 10mm bolt right up top here. So we'll go ahead and back that out. This will void your warranty, but I'm gonna take this opportunity to plug these ratchets because I love them so much. They make these really sick, these are like 10 bucks, swiveling ratchet. So you can break your bolt loose, and then once it's loosened up, flip it, and now you've got sort of a nice nut driver, and you can spin it out real easy, which I love. And then down here, we've got another 10mm. And there's another one hidden in this little hole here. You're gonna wanna hold on to these because this is what holds your carburetor on and ultimately is gonna hold on our new air filter mount. Like I said, I saved the nuts, but the bolt can go. And then it's just a matter of kind of carefully shimmying this off. And you'll see now that the valve cover vents into the actual air box. We're gonna just pull this right off for now, and it's a good idea to either run a longer vent that goes down and sort of just vents out into the atmosphere, or they make really nice little filters that you can pop in here that just looks like a mini air filter, and that'll keep dirt and grime from getting into your valves. So you can totally pull the governor and then continue to run your stock exhaust and intake. It's actually a really cheap, totally free way to get a little better performance out of your engine. But in our case, we're gonna be putting on a new air filter, and so it came with this nice adapter, right? So that the air filter has something to actually grab onto. So we can go ahead and put this right on. And what you gotta be careful of is you've got these little sort of vent holes in the carburetor that are important for your idle and maintaining the engine RPM. And so this air filter mount has holes cut to accept both of those. And so we're just gonna make sure that we've got them lined up. And so you can see those line up quite nicely with those little holes. It's gonna give us good airflow like we need. All right, and then we'll take the nuts that came with it, with the Predator itself, and throw these back on. And with this particular kit, when you go to remove the actual airbox, that airbox holds down your choke lever. And so we wanna make sure it comes with this nice little hold down, and this gets screwed on right to the back here. And that gets tightened down to hold your choke lever in place. And then you take your air filter and just slide that right over that piece that we just installed, and that's gonna hold our air filter on. If you are gonna go through this process and you're not putting on an air filter and you intend to put the stock airbox back on, my best advice would be to put a piece of masking tape over your carburetor just so that you don't get dust and grime and stuff in there while you're working on it, because that is no bueno. All right, but now we have a better look at the actual throttle arm here and the governor and all that. And just to make things a little bit easier to see, let's go ahead and we can pull off the exhaust as well. We're pretty much done on this side of the engine for right now. Everything else we're gonna be doing is on the other side. So I'll go ahead and spin this. All right, to pop this exhaust off, we're just gonna grab a 13mm socket and back these out. That's not pretty, but if you're more careful than I'm being right now, you can actually save that exhaust gasket and reuse it if you haven't run the engine for too long. One thing to keep in mind and be careful of is when you are backing these out, especially if you're using an impact, these studs can actually be unthreaded and backed out of the actual block. And if that does happen, the easiest thing you can do is take both of the nuts and slide them on there. Take 2 wrenches and lock them against each other, and then you can actually use that to tighten the stud back into the block. So just a cool little tip for you. We got lucky, we didn't have to deal with it. You'll also notice that sometimes when you go to put on an aftermarket exhaust for these Predators, that these studs are too long and may get in the way of your new fancy straight pipe, like happened to us in episode 7. And if that's the case, you can either put some kind of a spacer, I cut my exhaust and re-welded it, or back these out entirely and get Allen-headed bolts that you can bolt in instead of using the studs like they are here. I see some people will stack a bunch of washers in there in order to snug down the exhaust, but we're not gonna worry too much about that here. Next thing we're gonna wanna do is crack open the side cover of the engine, because our governor lives right inside here, just on the back side of this cover. When you get these engines brand new, there is a little bit of oil in them from the factory, so we're gonna wanna use something to go ahead and prop this up so that we can try and keep as much of that sort of little bit of oil sloshed back to the back of the engine is not gonna spill out on us. Still a good idea to throw down a piece of cardboard or something that you don't care about in order to kind of catch that and not make a big old mess. So the side cover is held on with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 10mm bolts. So we'll go ahead and back those out. And it should go without saying, but if this weren't a new engine and we had oil in here, you're gonna wanna drain the oil before you crack this side cover off. You do wanna be careful though with your impacts. It's probably better to do this with a ratchet or a wrench just so that you don't strip anything out because this is an aluminum block. We're gonna be extra careful when we put them back in and make sure that they're all torqued to spec. Oh, another thing, on the brand new engines, you usually see that the key for the shaft here is zip tied onto the actual shaft of the engine itself. You're gonna want to pop that out like we did here. That way you can slide this out and it's not gonna get hit on this bearing here. But now, if we're real careful, see if we can pop this thing open. If you get lucky, again, sometimes you can reuse the gasket. In our case, I can see already that this thing is ripped, and so we're just gonna go ahead and use a gasket maker in order to replace that gasket. You can buy them, but gasket maker should be just fine. I was gonna try to avoid this, but we got unlucky. Our camshaft came out with the actual side cover here, and so we're gonna have to show you guys how to get one of these engines back in time, because you can see here, here's the little cam lobes. These control the intake and exhaust valves. This has to be in a particular orientation in the engine, lined up with this other gear here, in order to make sure that your engine is in time. And the way that you do that, and we'll look at more at it after, but you can see right here, since I've got it in my hands, this little hole that's drilled into the side of the camshaft is a little guide for you. And there's another one. In this case, it's not a hole drilled, but it's a tiny punched mark on the actual crankshaft. When we go to reassemble this, we'll get our valves back in position and make sure that when we put this camshaft back in, that it does actually line up both of those dots, and we should be good to go. So we made a little extra work for ourselves, but worth it to show you guys how that works. Okay, so let's just go ahead and actually take a look at the internals of the engine here. Since we've got it open, we can take a peek. Generally, your camshaft is sitting right in here, and we'll see that when we go to reassemble it. Here, our push rods for the valves are kind of just hanging limply since the camshaft's not in there anymore. Again, this is our crankshaft, and this right here is just a balancing shaft that's in there to kind of reduce vibration and make the engine run a little bit smoother. This guy right here, we're actually gonna be pulling out. This is the low oil sensor. It's kind of nice to have in the event of a rollover because it'll kill your engine. We're also gonna be riding around and off-roading and on bizarre angles, so we want to make sure that we're not just cutting out randomly, so we're gonna just pull this right out. The other thing we're looking at here is, this is the little lever arm that goes up through the block and connects to the governor arm up top here, and so this is gonna get removed as well. And then finally, we got distracted by the camshaft, but this right here is the actual gear for the governor, and we're gonna be removing this also. Classic how we try to do an easy video and every time. Well, the good news is, now that the camshaft's out of the way, we have easier access to these two little 8mm bolts that hold in the low oil sensor. We can back those out. Now, in my case, I had already removed the external part of the low oil sensor and cut it off, and so there's a good chance I should be able to just yank that right through. This is junk, we don't need it. In order to fully remove the oil sensor, the low oil sensor, we're gonna come over here to the other side of the block, and this is where generally you would see wires that come out and plug in to your key start, which we've also removed that. Sorry guys. And so this right here is going to be a 14mm. We can pop this off, and then that's gonna allow us to just push this right through. And there's the rest of that mangled oil sensor that we are not gonna use. So what we're ultimately gonna do is actually go in and tap threads into the hole that we brought this out of, and I've got a bolt that we're gonna feed in there, but I figure we'll do all the tapping at once. For now, we're just gonna leave it, but you definitely don't wanna leave just an empty hole in the side of your block. Full disclosure, you can just leave the oil sensor in there and disconnect it from the outside, and by just unplugging it, you get to the same place. It will no longer kill your engine when it senses low oil. But for us, we're yanking it out because we don't need it, doesn't need to be in there, and it'll give us a little bit more volume for oil down there, which would be kind of nice. But let's just keep on cruising. Next, we're gonna pull off the actual governor arm, our trusty 10mm. Loosen this up. And you can see here, even just loosening that is not enough to get this all the way off. Actually, in our case, it is, it's gonna pop up. But if it's too tight on you, you can jam a screwdriver right in there and open these two little, this little slit up, and you can pop this off even just a little bit easier. Nice. On the other side, it's got this tiny little spring, and you can just pull it right off. We're not gonna need that. And so then you can see the next thing holding it in, so we've got this little cotter pin. I can go ahead and get my pliers on this cotter pin and just yank that right off. Whoop. Nice. This arm is now completely sort of free to move, and we can drop this down and into the engine. We may have to move it around a little bit in order to get all the internals out of the way. But you do want to spin the little arm here into the engine in order to get the clearance you need to drop it down and out. And I think, yeah, we're gonna have to turn this a little bit. Okay, so I'm just using the pull start to kind of move it over just enough to get the crankshaft out of the way. And there we go. Nice. There is, in fact, a washer in there that you definitely want to pull out. This guy right here. And so we'll just kind of get in there and pull this right out. We don't want to forget about that. Have that clanking around in your engine. And while we're at it, in here there's a little O-ring, which I'm gonna pull out and replace with my own after the fact. There you go. And again, just like over here, we're gonna take our tap and die set and tap in some threads and Loctite a couple bolts in here so that we can just close these holes up forever because we're never gonna need them again. So that's all that we have to do on the actual engine block. The rest of the governor removal is over here on our side cover. So depending on the type of engine you have, these can be a little bit tricky because you can see this is all held in with this little center nipple here, this guy. And so we're gonna wanna get this out, right? And once we do, that's gonna allow us to release the entire governor gear. But I think the easiest thing to do is gonna be to kind of break this gear apart, and then we'll be able to get the whole thing out. So let me grab some. So for this, I'm gonna misuse some tin snips. Just cutting this thing up. So essentially what we're going for is I made some cuts here. That way I can bend back and peel away the part of the gear that's, that's keeping these little arms in place. Now we can open these up all the way. This little guy pops right out. And now the only thing left holding the actual governor spring in is this tiny little ring that you can see in there. We're just gonna try and get under there with a flathead screwdriver and see if we can bust this thing out. There she goes. I just finally got it in there and bent it, and now it should just release and we can pull this whole thing off. So there's the little guy we were struggling with. I always hold on to these. It makes a great cartilage piercing. All right, so we got the governor gear out and tossed in the trash. Just like on the underside of the governor arm here, there was a washer. There's gonna be one right here behind that gear as well. So we wanna make sure that we grab this and pull that out also. Again, we want no metal whatsoever bouncing around in our crankcase here. Our little valve tappets here are just sort of hanging loosely since our cam fell out we're just gonna push those all the way up into as far as they'll go. That way we can get our cam back in, and we'll have to take the valve cover off in order to reseat those push rods. I think all that's left to do at this point is let's go in and actually tap out these holes so we can get some bolts in there. We're gonna actually drill this top hole here out to 5/16 in order to accept that tap. But before we do that, again, we don't want any kind of metal chips or anything like that inside the actual engine when we're done. And so in order to collect those, I'm going to pack the hole first full of some grease. Just some synthetic grease, nothing fancy here. Fill that right up, and I can feel it coming through the other side. And that's gonna collect all those chips for us so they don't go flying everywhere. Throw a little bit of paper towel inside the actual engine. That way, anything that does fall, we're gonna catch right on here. So let's get in from the top. Looks good. Now that we've done that, I'm gonna pack that hole full one more time with our grease to catch our actual tap shavings this time. And we'll grab our 3/16 tap, get that nice and set up, and nice and easy, start these threads. You wanna be real careful when you're just getting them started. That's gonna be sort of the trickiest part. But it is nice, again, this block is aluminum, and so it's gonna cut these threads in real nice and easy. Okay. Not a bad idea every once in a while to kind of back up just a little bit to clear the chips and continue going down and through. Back up just a little. And we'll keep cutting. I'll make sure to put links to the specific tap sizes that we use here in this video, but I'll also put a link to, this is just a set from Harbor Freight that I got that has all the most important sizes that you're gonna find yourself wanting to have, and if you're doing this stuff like we do, it's kind of indispensable, you gotta have it. We're approaching a point here where the actual tap is interfering with these gas tank mounts, and so you'll see me kind of pull this thing off, readjust a little bit, and we can keep going. If you've got a socket that fits the tap, that's also a nice way to do it. Every time I feel it starting to get a little bit tight on me, that's when I kind of go ahead and back up, let those chips clear a little bit, and you can see all those chips right there that are getting caught in the grease, which is exactly what we want. We don't want that crap knocking around in our engine. So we're all the way through. Now we can carefully back this guy back out. And there we go. You can, as you saw in there, the paper towel caught everything that dropped in and through. And here on our tap, we've kind of collected a lot of those shavings here and avoided dropping them down and into the engine. All right. So now we're good with this. We can set that aside. And I think at this point, just because we've got so much kicking around, I'm just gonna carefully here remove our paper towel, get all this out of the way. Put one more in. That way we can go ahead and spray some brake cleaner down and through that and get the rest of those chips out. So nice and careful so we don't knock anything loose. Again, you're better off being extra careful and not having to deal with any of these little shards getting down into your engine. One more shot with the brake clean. Okay. Let all that settle on and in. And we're looking pretty good. Now that we've got that hole cleaned all out, we're gonna take our bolt, throw a washer on there, and then because this hole has sort of a recess in it, we're gonna use about 3 of these O-rings here in order to fill that gap. Take our red Loctite and hit these threads pretty good, because we do not ever intend for this bolt to come back out. One more paper towel in there for good measure in case I missed anything. You can see that as I tighten this down, those O-rings are gonna drop right down into that hole We can go ahead and tighten that right down. Don't want to go too hard because that Loctite is going to take care of making sure that doesn't come out on us, and we do not want to strip out those threads that we just worked so hard on. I'm going to give it one more little wipe down with some brake cleaner. Now what we're going to do is go ahead and slide this over, and we're going to kind of repeat the process on the hole that we have for the oil fill. Same exact process. I'm going to fill this, this hole with our grease. And now for this one, I'm going to be using a 7/16 tap with a thread pitch of 20. And here's the bolt that we're gonna use. You wanna make sure this is a nice, small enough bolt so you're not gonna worry about it impacting anything on the inside of the engine, any of the rotating mass that we're gonna see in there. So for this one, like I was saying, if you have the right size socket, you can actually throw your tap into a socket, and we're gonna do that on this one because we are running into some clearance issues. This is a trick I learned from Redbeard, shout out to him. This is a 7mm 12-point socket, and for what seems to be standard tap sizes, it kind of locks right in there perfectly, which is nice. So we'll go ahead and use this in order to tap out our second hole. And again, I'm just gonna kind of tuck a little bit of paper towel in here just to catch anything that happens to fall down to the bottom of the engine, but we should be all right. Not a bad idea if you are using a ratchet to do this. Grip it down low, that way you're not putting too much torque on your tap, and also helps you kind of keep it straight as you cut those threads. We're all the way through. We can back this one out. Looks like our grease has done its job, and we've got ourselves another set of threads. I can just kind of reach in and grab that blob of grease that's holding the majority of those chips for us, which is perfect. That's just what we want. Again, I'm gonna kind of plug the hole here, that way we're not spraying our chips into the engine. All right, so we're not gonna need a washer on this one because there's no sort of gap to fill, but we are gonna use an O-ring at the bottom of this bolt just to help us get our nice oil-tight seal. Come back with our red Loctite, a nice generous helping. And then we'll thread this right into that hole that we just tapped. The oil that is left over from the factory has sort of all the nasty grease and stuff from the internals that is still on there. So I'm just gonna go ahead and kind of clean this stuff out while we're at it. Definitely worth the extra effort to make sure you get all those little chips. You don't want anything floating around in your engine. Using the brake cleaner here to just knock down the excess. We're gonna need more paper towels. Oh, that's f***ed. I'm gonna literally have to go rinse my eye out. Hang on. All right. So now we're gonna go ahead and reinstall our cam that fell out on us. What you're gonna wanna do is make sure that both of your little valve tappets, I suppose they're called, are pushed up as far as they'll go. We're gonna have to pull the valve cover off to set the push rods again. But here's where we're gonna have to take into account the little dot on our camshaft as well as on our crankshaft. We've got our dot right here. We'll go ahead and we're gonna want those two dots to end up meshed up just perfectly. Just like that. You can see here, we've got what I guess I would call the male end of this tooth on the crankshaft that has our dot there, and the female groove of our camshaft there has the dot there, and they're lined up perfectly. And because our gasket broke, we're gonna have to fully remove this, and you're gonna wanna go along and make sure that the entire place that the gasket sits on both the crankcase itself and that cover is nice and clean. So we're just gonna take a little razor blade here and work our way across. And once again, I'm using a paper towel just to make sure that none of these little shavings of gasket and or aluminum are gonna get down and into our engine. Now we've got the engine side cleaned up, we're just gonna do the same thing over here. I'll try and remove as much of this by hand as I can. Again, being careful if you are using a razor blade like I am, that you don't cut into the actual aluminum of the side cover or of the engine block. If I don't have to remove a ton of material, I'll actually scrape the opposite direction and just use it as a flat edge. Just kind of scrape away that gasket material.
3 days later.
Well, that took forever, but it's worth it to get it right. We've got our gasket cleaned off to where I'm pretty happy with it. There's a little bit left over, but I think we're gonna be just fine. We've got what looks like a pretty good surface there. Also, off camera, I went ahead, sprayed some brake clean on a paper towel and just fully cleaned up and got all the oil off of the surfaces we're gonna make this gasket here. And because I don't have an actual side cover gasket for the 420, we're just gonna use the ultra black Permatex gasket maker to do the job, and it should be just fine. Go ahead and we're gonna put down a nice healthy little bead of this, and everywhere that we have a bolt hole, I'm gonna go ahead and just completely close it in just like that, just like you would see with the actual gasket. We've got our gasket maker on there. It's looking pretty good. Let it set up for a couple minutes here while Trey was switching batteries, and we can go ahead and just slide this right back on to the shaft here. Something that I did preemptively that I like to do is I went ahead and poured a little bit of oil, engine oil, into these bearings here because I did clean this all the way out with brake clean. And so I just want to make sure all the crevices are nice and lubed up so we're not burning our bearings out when we go to start this thing up. So without further ado, let's go ahead and just carefully line this up, and there we go. We're in business. Now, if you're using gasket maker like we are, we're gonna go ahead and just hand tighten all of the side cover bolts here. That way, we don't squish all of the gasket maker between the block and the side cover. And after about an hour, then you can go ahead and come back and torque everything down to spec. So like I said, we're just hand tightening these down. You can see I'm going in sort of a star pattern approximately, just to make sure that we get equal pressure across the side cover here. That way we don't squish our gasket out one side or the other. And you're gonna wanna do the same thing when you actually come back with a torque wrench and torque these to spec. We'll put spec on screen here. I don't know it off the top of my head. We'll figure that out later. And we're looking pretty good. We're almost done. All right, so because our cam fell out, we're gonna have to pull this valve cover off. Hopefully that doesn't happen to you, but if it does, you get to see it down here first. It's actually kind of a good thing because in the majority of the videos that I've seen of governor removals for the 420, most of the time they get lucky and that camshaft stays in. So in case it does happen, we're gonna show you how to handle that. So right here, I've got myself an 8mm socket. We're gonna just back these out. Should be 6 of these guys. And then ever so gently coax this bad baby off, and we got lucky. No issues. All right, so when our camshaft fell out, our push rods and everything fell out of their seats in the actual rocker arms. So we're gonna go ahead and reseat those now. Let's see if I can do it by hand. Oh yeah, nice. I wanna just double check. I'm feeling around to see that the bottom half of the push rod is still in its little home. On the inside of the block, you saw those, the push rod tappets, I think they're called. This push rod on the opposite side has another ball like this, and it needs to sit in a little socket on the opposite side into that tappet. If you have it just set in there, it's not gonna do what it needs to do. So we wanna make sure it feels like it's set in there pretty nice. As you can see, this one's just totally loose, so we're gonna have to reset that one, but that's not that big of a deal. I can actually look down and see the hole that I need to put it into. It's gonna be impossible to show on camera, but you'll just have to believe me. You can see it's not flapping around. It's sitting right in there, just how we want it. And before we went ahead and did this, I moved the engine to top dead center. Top dead center being the piston as far out towards the head as it'll possibly go. And that way our valves are gonna be in the right position that we should just be able to kind of muscle these in by hand. Worst case scenario, we can loosen these up and reset our valve lash after the fact. Oh, it's so close. All right, so we got one. I'm gonna have to adjust the position of the engine just a little bit so I can get the other. But we got our exhaust valve set up on there just how we want it. You can see the little ball here on our push rod is now seated inside of the rocker arm socket. And like I said, I was able to do that by hand. We're gonna, okay. I'm gonna just rotate the engine over a little bit. All right, here we go, this should go. Ooh. And there we have it. So nothing to be afraid of. If your cam falls out or you wanna just replace your cam with a high performance one, pretty simple. If you're not doing the springs, like we're not here, you should just be able to kind of set this all back up by hand. The reason that we're not doing higher tension springs here is because since we took the governor out, I'm actually gonna basically be governing this engine by the valve float. So at a certain RPM, the springs are not gonna be strong enough to slam the valve shut anymore, and we'll actually lose compression, probably close to, I'd say 5,500 RPM. And that's gonna stop the engine from being able to keep continuing to spin up faster and faster, which in the case of the way we're doing this build, since we haven't built the actual internals of the engine, that's gonna be my kind of little way of making sure that we don't blow this thing up, or at least trying not to. But now that that's set back up, we can go ahead and take our valve cover, set this right back on. No need to adjust the lash or anything here because we haven't actually really changed anything. We're just putting everything back in place. It's tempting to just drive these back down with the impact, but I'm gonna be very careful to get all of these pretty well started by hand or with the ratchet so that I don't cross thread and end up stripping out the holes in the block. And just like with just about anything else, we're gonna wanna actually tighten this down in sort of a crisscross star pattern to make sure that we get a nice even distribution of force on these bolts and on our gasket. And just like before, we're gonna put the torque spec on screen for you guys because I don't know it off the top of my head, but we're gonna torque it all down off camera. So we've got our governor removed, we've plugged up the holes, we pulled off our air filter and put on our brand new one, dealt with our camshaft mishap, reset and put our push rods back into place. Our valves are all set up right. Our timing is good. We lined everything up. Last thing to do here is now, because we got rid of that governor, we're just gonna have to go ahead and drill a hole in this arm, rebend this original throttle linkage, and we're gonna use that to actually control our throttle. So we'll go ahead and take a look at that next. All right, so we're all put back together. All that's left is getting our stock carburetor to now work with this new setup. It's a little bit tricky and counterintuitive, but in the stock configuration, when, you can see the return spring is on the back side here, and so this would be your full throttle position, right? All the way out here, and then it wants to return back to idle. So full throttle, return to idle. But now, because we've eliminated the governor, what I'm gonna do is drill a hole in this arm and then make a little Z-bend in this existing stock push rod, I suppose you could call it, throttle extension. But because we've now eliminated the governor, it's gonna reverse it. So instead of this now being full throttle, if you look inside the actual carburetor, you can see in there our butterfly for the actual throttle. So that's actually exactly the opposite of what it used to be. And so what we're gonna have to do is actually move our return spring. So instead of it pulling the throttle back this way, we're gonna flip it, and that way it returns to this position, and then you're gonna have to reroute your throttle cable such that when you go and step on the gas, it's gonna pull this arm forwards. So it's a little bit confusing, but it shouldn't be too hard. Let's go ahead and grab some needle nose. For the sake of this video, I'm just gonna try and reuse the existing return spring, but it might not be a bad idea to replace it with one that fits a little bit better. Just for the sake of demonstration, let's stretch this over and hook it on here. I don't love the look of this, but just to show you guys, this is now gonna be our throttle return, right? So at rest, we're at what used to be the full throttle position, okay? So now that we have that, we're gonna push our throttle all the way into the fully closed sort of idle position. And I'm just gonna go ahead and make a mark right here on my push rod. And that's where I'm gonna make my bend straight up and then bend it over through a hole that I drill right here in the lever. Some people like to cut this lever down so it's just not hanging out here, but I like the ability to reach back and manually rev the engine from when I'm standing behind the cart. I'm gonna try and kind of set this up in such a way that it has a nice linear path when it goes to pull. So I think right here is gonna look like a good spot for our hole to be drilled. And so we'll go ahead and grab, I wanna say this is a 5/32 drill bit. I would definitely recommend pulling this off the engine to do this. There we go. Don't try that at home, kids. Pull it off, do it on a drill press, clamp it down to your bench. Do as I say, not as I do. This little spring right here is part of that governor situation. We're not gonna need this anymore, so we can yank that right off. If you've got a Z-bend tool, feel free to use it. But for us, we're gonna use a couple needle nose. Okay. Give ourselves a little bend. We'll score it and bend it off. There we go. Get that bad Larry through there. So now you can see we're getting the sort of action that we want, but in order to keep it from clanking around like that, let's do one more bend in there. I think we've got ourselves a throttle. Not too bad. So you'll have to get creative with how you attach your actual throttle cable at this point, because it's no longer gonna go and sit right in here into this guy. But you can see they were kind enough to give us another throttle lock nut there. We'll figure out some way to kind of attach. Maybe off here I'll weld something and potentially cut this piece off and weld it up over here so I can pull the throttle this way. And we'll have ourselves a throttle. Slap our air filter back on, tighten her down, and we're good to go. Not so bad, right? You'll have to reconnect your fuel line, right? I suggest putting in a fuel filter, always a good idea. Again, the little vent up here, I'll put a link in the description as well for where you can get a nice little crankcase vent filter to pop right in there. As far as braking goes, best practice would be to fill this up with oil, run it, let it idle for about 15, maybe 20 minutes. You can rev it a little bit if you'd like, just be careful because there's no more governor, so it's gonna rev up pretty high. And then after that, pop the drain plug out, drain that old oil, and fill it up with brand new stuff. That way you can flush out, if you may have missed a little bit of that metal flake from when we did our tapping, or any of the gasket material that may have fallen inside, you can take care of all that. After that, you're pretty much good to go. So if you guys found this helpful, let us know. Hit that like button, subscribe if you want to stick around and see this bad boy go into that red cart. Things are gonna be absolutely wild. This is gonna be a really fun build. But if you've got any questions, feel free to hit us up in the comments. I get to just about everything. I'm honestly a little glad that our camshaft fell out, because like I said, I haven't really seen a whole lot of videos tackle what to do if that were to happen, and clearly it can. So, blessing in disguise. We have a lot of those here, don't we?
Always.
Well, I think that just about wraps it up. We'll catch you guys on the next one.